Gruß. Willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 7 of my organisational series of videos. In this video I'll be providing an overview of the Allied corps system during the Napoleonic War. To avoid repeating myself, viewers should first watch the previous video, which provides an overview of corps and divisions and their development in the French army. This video covers the equivalent corps organisations in the Allied armies, starting with columns and wings and moving to large brigades and divisions, and finally ending with the Allied armies which adopted the corps, or for the Austrians, Armeeabteilung or Russian division structure. Prussia and Austria adopted the divisional system by the early 19th century, but their divisions remained largely administrative, or when they did exist in the field, ad hoc. The Russians did develop military divisions and combat divisions by 1805, but they were incredibly cumbersome and lacked the appropriate staff to manage the brigades and regiments adequately. In Britain, brigades and divisional organisations were ad hoc, with formations established for specific expeditions. Just a quick note about the strengths which are shown in the following charts. While the values for the corps size formations are taken from actual sources from the period in question, the individual strengths of the lower level formations in the video represent their full strength state. I lack any detailed strengths in terms of manpower for the formations in questions when they were in the field. As a result, if you total the subordinate formations and compare it with the actual corps size formation totals, it will not match. In 1800 at Marengo, the Austrians organised their army into what they call wings, although the wings were anything but even. Two of the wings were effectively divisional sized rather than anything which could be considered a corps, even a small corps. The centre wing represented the largest component of the army. The command structure was also unclear for this particular wing, with both the C&C and the wing commander sharing command of the centre wing. This was a very ad hoc and confusing formation indeed. The left wing was of a reasonable size, although even compared with the small corps the French were using at the time, it was very small. The Austrians did not adopt anything similar to a formal corps structure in 1800 at Marengo, and what was organised was clearly very ad hoc. At Hohenlinden, in the same year, the Austrians were organised into column, which was a common method when they used when moving their armies around. I'm guessing column means that it's an actual column for movement purposes, although this is a guess. Each column was of equal strength, with them ranging from 13,000 to 19,000 men each. Each column also represented a combined arms force, which means it was organised, in theory, in the same manner as corps, and served much the same purpose, possibly. The largest column contained the C&C, but it was not really oversized compared with the smallest column. So the question is, how does a column differ from a French-style corps? The main difference was its permanence. A column was assembled for the moment and could change quickly as the need arose. This gave it less cohesion than the more permanent French corps system. Even in 1800, where the French corps system was not really fully permanent, but it was more permanent than, let's say, the Allied wings. Should be noted the Austrians did use the divisional system, which was a more permanent system than, let's say, the column, so at least the units within the division did operate together for a longer period of time, and in 1800 they were probably together for a couple of years, so there was probably a reasonable level of cohesion. When we move over to 1805, in this case the forces which were involved at the Battle of Ulm, the Austrians initially moved into Bavaria in 4 columns. The column was a combined arm formation and, in theory, could operate in the same manner as a corps, but in 1805 or in the 1805 campaign this did not occur. The largest column consisted of over 40,000 men, and during the subsequent campaign was divided into 2 parts. One interesting change I noticed compared with 1800 is the subordinate formations in the columns were named brigades rather than divisions. Perhaps my 1800 source misnamed the formation, as a division was supposed to have some level of combined arms capability, and there seemed little difference from the division in 1800 and the brigades in 1805. This chart here clearly shows a difference between theoretical strength and actual strength. In both cases, the actual strength of the brigade was less than their theoretical strength. I expect some of the battalions or squadrons were elsewhere when these columns moved into Bavaria. During the campaign, these columns did not operate as a cohesive corps-like formation, with the result they were always bested by the numerically superior French corps. While the columns may have looked like corps when looking at a chart, they certainly did not operate in that manner. By 1809, the Austrians had adopted the Korps, or, in their nomenclature, Army-Abteilung structure. These corps-sized formations did possess a dedicated command and staff structure, but they were only assembled in times of war. The old wings did not contain a dedicated command and staff structure, and the subordinate units were not familiar in terms of operating with each other. At least those problems had been overcome. The French system ensured many of the Corps' subordinate formations were deployed together, even in peacetime. However, even without this familiarity, the new Austrian system had a significant impact on their performance in 1809. The Austrians had certainly not reached the same point as the French in 1809, but they were getting close. This shows the two largest corps, the first and second, which contained almost as many troops as the entire Austrian army at Marengo each. The scale of this war had dramatically grown. By 1813, the Austrians had ironed out most of the issues with the Army-Abteilung structure. The size of these corps structures had dropped, but the command and staff were permanent and highly professional, as well as familiar with the troops they commanded. Overall, the Austrians performed reasonably well in 1813 and 1814, even if they proved rather cautious. The Austrians also created the Einteilung corps structure, which was their advanced corps, heavy cavalry corps, and a reserve corps structure as well. While these did exist in 1809, in 1813 they were fully formed and their structure stable and formal. In many ways the Austrians had surpassed the French by creating these specialist corps, although the French did have corps which served similar functions in a more ad hoc manner. After the defeat in 1805, the Austrian army undertook a number of reforms, as well as reversing many of the earlier reforms. The corps system was introduced with a permanent assignment of regiments to divisions and corps. The necessary staff were added to allow for the corps to operate independently. Each corps was roughly of similar size and contained an all-arms structure. Unfortunately for the Austrians, there was not sufficient time to train the new corps commanders adequately, which did result in suboptimal performance, particularly in 1809. Without orders from the CNC, the corps did not operate in a proactive manner, and in some cases were unusually tardy. Other reforms included the organisation of artillery into batteries, rather than distributing them among regiments. An increased focus on light infantry was instigated, however the larger change was the manner that they were used. Prior to this, most existing light infantry was concentrated into the advanced divisions. Now they were distributed in a more even manner. The final reform was the introduction of Landwehr, which was resisted but nonetheless did provide some additional manpower to the Austrians in 1809. The Austrians were on the correct path, but they were not ready in 1809. They were, however, ready in 1812 and especially in 1813 and 1814. In 1805, the Russians did have some combat formations in a divisional structure, specifically the Guards. This does not seem to be a combined arms formation, so it was simply a convenient manner of organising the Guards. The Allies and Russians organised their armies into columns in 1805, which looked like corps but lacked the cohesion of the French corps. Within a standard column, the Russians primarily used brigades, which appeared to be a single arms formation, although artillery was allocated to them. By 1807, the Russians had adopted the combat division structure, which in terms of size was very similar to a corps structure. This was a reasonably standard combined arms formation. I've read in many places that this formation was cumbersome, but no explanation as to why. My only guess was that the French and Austrian corps were made up of a combined arms formation with adequate staff at the corps level. In the case of the Russian division, this may not have been the case, so may have been the reason for this cumbersomeness. Whatever its shortcoming, this was a significant improvement over the ad hoc column structure used in 1805. Based on one source I had, in 1812 the divisional structure was replaced with a corps structure. However, this was effectively identical to the old divisional structure except larger, and I'm not really certain if it actually really even occurred. The subordinate formations were now divisions rather than brigades in this new structure. I suspect the source is incorrect and the divisional structure remained with subordinate brigades, as other sources indicate, even after 1812. This division shows a 3-brigade division. Some sources indicated the standard structure was 2 line infantry, 1 Jager and 1 cavalry brigade with each division. However, this TO&E does not reflect this. I suspect this is an example of the difference between theory and reality. I find many sources I read about the Russian structure contain conflicting and confusing information, so when investigating them you need to be rather careful. When Russia went to war in 1805, the Tsar had instigated a complete reform of the Russian army, modelling it after the Prussians. This could be why they adopted a small division structure, or at least a very early type of such a structure. After the defeats of 1805, the Russians instigated another reform, this time focusing on its administration, that is, of the division. The final divisional structure was introduced as a result, with each division adopting many of the attributes of the French Corps. The Russians originally formed 13 permanent divisions, which to the best of my knowledge contained permanently assigned regiments. The result was a Russian army which, like the Austrians in 1809, caused the French significant issues in 1806. The Russians started raising militia in 1807, some of which did see action before the end of the hostilities, that is, in the 1806-1807 hostilities. The Russians tweaked their structure in 1808 and 1809, the main change being fixing 3 brigades per division. By 1811, the number of divisions had risen to 25, with 3 basic fixed structures. The number of Jager, basically light infantry, was dramatically increased. By 1812, the divisions consisted of 2 line infantry brigades, 1 Jager brigade and a cavalry brigade, with a significant artillery pool. In July 1812, the militia was raised, which resulted in the formation of a very large number of troops. The divisional structure was effectively the Russian answer to the French Corps, although unlike the French, the subordinate formations lacked the flexibility and all arms attributes to operate independently. This resulted in the Russian division lacking the flexibility of the French and even Austrians in 1813. However, apart from this issue, they could function in a similar manner to the French Corps and prove very successful indeed. The Prussian army in 1806 had a surprisingly advanced structure, which I do find puzzling. The Prussians used combined arms divisions, which were almost corps size, small corps. These were organised into what my sources called corps, but probably represented an army wing or column. The result was a very large corps, although one which was likely ad hoc and only formed for the campaign. The other main corps used in 1806 was even larger than one shown earlier and contained 5 divisions. In reality, these corps were similar to columns, but used another name in my sources. I don't even know if the Prussians called them corps. They were pulled together using whatever formations was available, and the staff and combined structure was ad hoc in the extreme, as per the normal practice. The result was several command failures at critical points in the battle, especially at Austerlitz. We can say the actual structure the Prussian used was a divisional structure, although some of the divisions were rather large and getting close to what a corps was supposed to look like. The Prussians went through a significant reorganisation process after their defeat in 1806-7, and the result was the Prussian corps structure, which was made up of a number of large brigades and supported by cavalry brigades. The brigade were combined arms, containing cavalry as well as artillery, so they did not differ from a French or Austrian division. As with the French and Austrians, these combined arms formations were organised into a combined arms corps structure with specialist brigades, in effect a mini-army. The Prussian corps system lacked the flexibility of the French system, as the French had specific cavalry corps, but within this rather large corps structure it had everything it needed to fight a battle by itself. This may have been its purpose, a mini-army basically. By 1815, the Prussian corps structure had taken this mini-army idea forward. The brigades were no longer combined armed formations and were smaller, but now we had 2 cavalry brigades and 4 infantry brigades. In practice, the cavalry were allocated to the brigades as required, so the brigades still retained their combined arms approach. Overall, the Prussian corps operated very well, within the limitation the Prussians found themselves in. In 1806, the Prussians had no permanent organisation structure greater than the regiment, so its 14 temporary divisions and pseudo-corps were all ad hoc in nature. After the defeats in 1806 and 1807, Prussia undertook significant reforms across almost all aspects of its army. In 1812, it formed a division of 3 infantry brigades and 2 cavalry brigades. In 1813, after a period of mobilisation, the Prussians formed 4 corps, which were similar to the divisions raised in 1812. The main difference was the size of the brigades, which were now swelled out by the reserves and later Landwehr regiments. As far as I can work out, the corps were not permanent formations prior to 1813, but in practice the brigades tended to remain with their parent corps, even in peacetime. I have to assume the Prussians were forced to create a fully functional corps system between its declaration of war against the French and its first major engagement. Thus, some organisational confusion is expected. To assist its corps creation, they were spread across the armies of all its allies. In 1814, the Prussian corps were beginning to operate effectively, although the initial corps did perform well at Leipzig in 1813. By the end of 1814, the Prussians had fine-tuned their corps system. When Prussia went to war in 1815, it mobilised 6 corps, with the first 4 initially sent to meet the French. The Prussians had made many minor changes, the main one being an increase in the number of brigades in all 4 corps. The 4 corps in 1815 had permanently allocated subordinate regiments. The Prussians were finally perfecting the corps system, although I would argue not to the level of the Austrians and French. Let's end this video with the British. While the British did possess a corps structure in 1815, all the sources I have read indicates the corps did not operate as independent corps and were closer to the old idea of columns, with Wellington commanding everything in great detail. Considering the size of Wellington's army, this was possible and may have even given the British a critical edge. The one interesting takeaway was the divisions, which were large and had a good infantry-artillery mix. I assume the cavalry, held at army level, was allocated as required. In 1815, the British had a British Corps and an Allied Corps and a Cavalry Corps. As far as I can work out, Wellington did not allow the Prince of Orange the autonomy you would expect a Corps commander to possess. As indicated, the British did not need a Corps system, but did possess a reasonably good divisional system. I also suspect the reason why they got away without having a Corps system was Wellington and his staff's brilliance and experience. A lesser commander may have not done so well without the corps system in place. The main takeaway I can provide is that armies grew in size. They were no longer able to be commanded by a single CNC. They needed to be divided into self-contained, semi-independent formations, which could generally do the right thing when the CNC was not around. If the CNC was lucky enough to have very good corps commanders, the CNC could leave those sectors to those commanders and focus where the CNC was required to focus. If the corps commander were not that good, then the results were less than optimal, as possibly we saw with the French in 1815. The corps system was the only system which could work when the armies started to exceed 20,000 men. Even within the corps, you needed independent divisional structures. It's hard to know what the maximum number of troops a single commander could command, but I suspect 20,000 to 30,000 men was about the most you could expect to deal with without a corps structure underneath you. France fell into the structure for a variety of historical reasons, but Napoleon expanded it, fine-tuned it to create the final corps system. France's opponents were, in some cases slow, in some cases quick, able to duplicate, or they did duplicate the system. The Austrians and Prussians had their own system fully in place by 1813, although the Austrians had an early version which proved to be successful in 1809. The Russians never really adopted this system fully, but its divisional structure was close enough, and the British never really needed it, or at least they never adopted it or thought they needed it. To end this video, let's analyse why the divisional and corps system proved so effective. The common reason provided is the old move divided, fight united theory. While this could be a reason, and certainly applies to the divisional structure, when we move to corps size, the columns achieve the same objective as this. If we look at the Battle of Hohenlinden in 1800, the Austrians were organised into 4 columns, each of which was advancing up a different road. In this case, there was no real need for a corps structure. The column structure worked perfectly well, for this purpose at least. Thus, what is the difference between the column and corps structure which makes the corps structure superior? The second reason provided is that the divisional corps is an all-arms formation which has the flexibility and ability to attack or defend as required. If you are defended, it would be wise to have a lot of infantry supported by artillery and cavalry. This may have well been a major reason why the divisional structure was created and does provide significant benefits. Many armies contained advanced guards formations prior to the creation of the division and corps structure. On the left we have an Austrian advance guard formation in 1800. At a strength of over 1,300 men, it was not very large, but it was a combined arms formation containing infantry, artillery and cavalry. On the right is an advanced guard division fielded by the Prussians in 1806, which also contained all three arms. The one interesting point is the high number of light infantry. For the Austrians, all the infantry were light, Jager and Grenz, and this will also apply to the Prussians, as the Fusiliers were considered light infantry. These formations were designed to operate independently, and I suspect they were commonly grouped together for most campaigns, so they would all be reasonably familiar with each other. However, when we look at the corps and column structure, they were also normally all arms in nature. This shows an 1805 Austrian column which contains all three arms, as well as a good mix of light infantry and light infantry. In this case, the cavalry were all heavy, but other columns had a mix of light and heavy cavalry. Thus, the corps advantage over a column was not to do with the all-arms concept. The final reason provided for the success of the corps structure is the formation, either divisional or corps, contained permanently allocated regiments. The idea of a formation containing the same troops is not new and is well known. Troops which normally operate with each other are familiar with each other and could operate more effectively together. This is the major difference between the corps and column, as a column is typically ad hoc. It was assembled as required and could change dramatically when combat occurred. If you ever look in detail at the Ulm campaign, where the Austrians were organised into four columns, one of which was split, when battle occurred, the troops involved could come from anywhere. Bits of one column and bits of another would be assembled together to sally out and to be defeated by the French. The columns may move in the same manner as corps, but they certainly did not fight in the same manner as a corps. This also dovetails into command. Who commanded what and when? Austerlitz is a good example of this confused command situation, but in some ways Marengo is a better example. Meles was the C&C, but also appeared to be commander of the centre wing. He gave command to the army to Zach after the initial success, but it seemed the C&C was directly commanding individual divisions. The wings had their own commanders, but the centre was the bulk of the army. The centre wing was certainly not too large to be commanded by a single commander, such as Meles, but Meles had to worry about the advance guard, left and right wings as well. This is not a good command structure if you want efficiency. When the Austrians initially developed their corps system, a major issue was many corps commanders still operated in the old manner, which meant they waited for command from the C&C rather than displaying the initiative. Austrian columns and corps commanders are often considered as being rather poor, but one reason could be their history of not taking any initiatives and always waiting for command in order to do anything. The Germans described this as Auftragtaktics, or mission tactics, although this term is not an official German military phrase. The subordinate is provided his mission objective, and it's up to the subordinate to achieve that in the best manner possible based on the real-life situation on the ground. It's all about making quick decisions and not waiting from orders above. The alternative is top-down command or method orders. The Austrian army, and for that matter the Prussians in 1806, used this top-down approach, which may have worked for smaller armies employing linear tactics, but failed miserably in the much faster tempo of column tactic warfare. The modern army uses the term Führen mit Auftrag to describe this. If your army is using a mission tactic system, the subordinate formation needs to be familiar with each other and the command structure needs to be simple and well structured. The division achieves this up to 10,000 men and the corps achieves this up to about 30,000 men. The column system failed to achieve this critical benefit, which is the reason why the column system proved ineffective against the French corps. So we come to an end of episode 7, in this case covering the Allied corps system during the Napoleonic War. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.